As the sun began its ascent over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the sprawling expanse of the airport, an unassuming scene unfolded within the terminal. Gate 37 stood quiet and serene, almost as if frozen in time. Passengers milled about, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors, while announcements crackled faintly through hidden speakers. Amid this tranquil setting, one figure stood out, not for his prominence but for his deliberate anonymity. Dressed in simple attire, devoid of any flashy accessories or entourage, he blended seamlessly into the crowd. To most observers, he appeared like any other traveler, perhaps returning home after a business trip or visiting family abroad. But appearances can be deceiving. This man was none other than Ibrahim Traoré, the President of Burkina Faso, a leader known not only for his humility but also for his unwavering commitment to staying grounded. Unlike many heads of state who travel surrounded by security details, cameras, and ceremonial fanfare, Traoré preferred a quieter approach. His belief in connecting with ordinary citizens guided his decision to travel incognito, free from the trappings of power that often create barriers between leaders and the people they serve. This morning marked no exception. Having recently concluded vital diplomatic discussions in Europe, conversations centered on Africa's sovereignty, economic independence, and future partnerships, he now sought nothing more than a peaceful journey back to his homeland. Traoré moved with purpose yet without pretense. As he approached the boarding area for Air France flight AF 726 bound for Ouagadougou, he exchanged warm greetings with airport staff, speaking fluent French with genuine kindness. Bonjour, CAVA, he asked a worker assisting passengers, eliciting a smile in return. The employee had no inkling of the man's true identity, which suited Traoré perfectly. Anonymity allowed him to observe the world around him, to absorb the nuances of human interaction without the filter of reverence or deference that often accompanies leadership roles. For Traoré, this wasn't merely a preference, it was a philosophy rooted in authenticity and empathy. Boarding the plane, Traoré nodded politely at the flight crew before taking his seat in business class, row 2A near the window. He settled in quietly, pulling out his phone to review notes from the recent diplomatic meetings. No one paid him much attention, no curious glances, no whispered speculations. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Yet unbeknownst to him, subtle undercurrents were already stirring elsewhere on the aircraft. A senior French businessman, accustomed to VIP treatment and red carpet privileges, was making his presence felt even before stepping foot onto the plane. Little did anyone know, these seemingly minor tensions would soon escalate into a storm that tested principles of dignity, respect, and equality. Thus begins our story, a tale of contrasts, where the calm exterior belies the turbulence brewing beneath. It is here, amidst the rising sun and quiet terminals, that we witness the collision of privilege and humility, arrogance and grace. What unfolds next will challenge assumptions, redefine boundaries, and leave an indelible mark on all involved. #### Seeds of Discord. The clash between privilege and equality. Moments after Ibrahim Traoré boarded the plane, the first signs of discord emerged, setting the stage for what would become a defining chapter in his life and a lesson for those fortunate enough to hear his story. Several rows behind him sat a high-profile French CEO, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms across Europe and Africa. Known for spearheading energy projects deemed strategic for African development, he was accustomed to receiving preferential treatment wherever he went. Red carpets, champagne flutes, and priority seating were not luxuries but expectations for someone of his stature, or so he believed. When the CEO arrived at the gate, however, reality proved less accommodating. Upon learning that business class was fully booked, his demeanor shifted instantly. Gone was the affable executive, in his place stood a man brimming with indignation. Tapping his polished leather shoes impatiently, he summoned airline staff, demanding an immediate resolution. "Do you realize who I am?" he barked, his voice laced with condescension. To him, the rules governing ordinary travelers simply didn't apply. This wasn't just about securing a comfortable seat, it was about asserting dominance, reinforcing hierarchies, and ensuring that his status remained untouchable. The situation escalated quickly when a senior flight attendant named Claire intervened. Tall, impeccably dressed in her Air France uniform, she exuded professionalism, but beneath her composed exterior lay frustration. After consulting with ground staff, Claire stepped aboard the plane, scanning the cabin with sharp, calculating eyes. Her gaze lingered briefly on Traoré, seated inconspicuously in row 2A. Without hesitation, she dismissed him as irrelevant. To her, he appeared too unremarkable to warrant attention, a black man in a hoodie, reading something on his phone, radiating calmness rather than authority. She leaned toward another attendant and muttered under her breath, probably a mistake. Confident in her assessment, Claire approached Traoré with a forced smile, her tone polite but firm. "Monsieur, may I see your boarding pass?" she requested, extending a hand expectantly.
Traore complied without hesitation, handing over the document.
Claire scrutinized it carefully, confirming the seat number matched his location. Still, doubt lingered in her mind. Something about his demeanor unsettled her, not because he projected arrogance, but precisely because he didn't. There was an air of quiet assurance about him, a quality that challenged her preconceived notions of who belonged in business class. Moments later, Claire returned, her smile now thinner, her tone slightly sharper. "Sir, I'm afraid we need to relocate you to economy to accommodate another passenger," she announced, attempting to soften the blow with vague promises of compensation.
Traore raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral but probing.
"And why me?" he asked calmly, his voice steady yet penetrating. Claire faltered momentarily but recovered swiftly. "No particular reason, sir," she replied, though her discomfort was palpable.
"It's just a minor adjustment for our guest." "A guest more important than me?"
Traore pressed, his words carrying a weight that transcended mere curiosity. Claire hesitated, unable to articulate a satisfactory response. Instead, she offered another insincere smile and repeated her request, hoping compliance would quell further inquiry.
But Traore remained resolute.
Meeting her gaze directly, he delivered a simple yet unequivocal declaration: "No, I will remain in my seat."
Claire's confidence wavered visibly.
And used to defiance, especially from someone she perceived as insignificant, she retreated momentarily to regroup. Meanwhile, whispers rippled through the cabin as nearby passengers took notice of the unfolding drama.
One man lowered his newspaper, curiosity piqued.
A woman paused mid-typing on her laptop, sensing the tension mounting.
Yet no one dared intervene. The atmosphere grew charged, each second amplifying the stakes.
Determined to resolve the issue, Claire turned her attention to other passengers. Moving systematically down the aisle, she singled out individuals based not on ticket validity but on appearance, specifically targeting those who fit certain stereotypes. When she reached a young African man seated several rows away, she pointed firmly at his seat.
"You, sir, we need you to move to economy," she declared, snatching his boarding pass before he could protest. The young man looked bewildered, stammering, "Why me?"
At this point, Traore rose from his seat, his presence commanding despite his understated demeanor. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but imbued with undeniable authority. All eyes turned to him as he addressed Claire directly.
"You are making decisions based on skin color, not tickets.
That's called discrimination."
Claire stiffened, taken aback by the accusation.
Recovering quickly, she attempted to assert control.
"Sir, please sit down. Don't cause a scene." But Traore refused to yield.
Fixing her with a steady, unflinching gaze, he continued, "If this is truly operational necessity, explain why I am being singled out and not others." Claire opened her mouth to respond, then closed it abruptly, realizing she had no coherent justification.
Around them, the once muted murmurs transformed into attentive silence.
Business-class passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some lowering their devices entirely to observe the confrontation unfold. The CEO, still waiting impatiently at the gate, remained oblivious to the growing turmoil inside the cabin.
Eventually, Claire relented, escorting him aboard with exaggerated politeness.
Offering him champagne and adjusting his seat cushion, she fawned over him as if compensating for her earlier failures. Meanwhile, Traore resumed his seat, his demeanor unchanged.
He fastened his seatbelt, fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest.
Though outwardly composed, his mind was sharp, calculating, and observant. He knew better than anyone that the true impact of this moment would reverberate far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Unbeknownst to Claire, or indeed, anyone else aboard, the wheels of justice were already turning. The insult directed at Traore was not merely personal, it symbolized a broader struggle against prejudice, inequality, and colonial legacies. By challenging Claire's discriminatory actions, Traore had planted the seeds of accountability, ensuring that the consequences of such behavior would soon come to light. As the plane taxied down the runway, leaving French soil behind, the invisible storm brewing within the cabin promised to reshape lives and perspectives long after touchdown. As the plane descended into Ouagadougou, the passengers aboard Air France Flight AF 726 remained largely unaware of the magnitude of what awaited them on the tarmac below. For most, the landing signaled the end of a routine journey, a transition from airborne confinement to the freedom of solid ground. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the moment carried profound significance, representing not just his return home but the restoration of dignity and pride for an entire nation. Outside the aircraft windows, the view unfolded dramatically, rows of black SUVs lined up with military precision, their glossy surfaces reflecting the blazing African sun.
Soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms immaculate, weapons held steadfastly at their sides. Behind them, ministers and top officials formed a solemn procession, their expressions grave yet resolute. This was no ordinary welcome, it was a display of sovereignty, strength, and unity. Inside the cabin, whispers began to ripple among the passengers. "Are we landing into a war zone?" one foreign traveler asked nervously, gripping the armrest as the plane touched down. Another replied dismissively, "No, this must be standard protocol for important arrivals." The French CEO, seated comfortably in business class, smirked confidently. Clearly relishing the spectacle, he leaned back in his chair, smoothing his suit jacket with practiced ease. "Must be for me," he chuckled smugly declare, the flight attendant hovering nearby. She laughed along obligingly, already envisioning herself escorting him off the plane ahead of everyone else, eager to curry favor with such a prestigious passenger. But the illusion of normalcy shattered the instant the aircraft came to a halt. Through the windows, the passengers watched as a tall officer in a black beret ascended the boarding stairs with measured strides. His boots echoed sharply against the metal steps, each sound reverberating through the silent cabin like a drumbeat of authority. The officer entered the plane, his presence commanding immediate attention. With slow, deliberate movements, he scanned the faces of the passengers until his eyes landed on Traore, seated quietly in row 2A. Without hesitation, the officer raised his hand to his forehead in a crisp military salute. "Monsieur le Président," he intoned, his voice resonating with respect and reverence, "welcome home." For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The collective intake of breath from the passengers was audible, followed by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. Hearts stopped beating momentarily as the realization dawned: the unassuming man in the hoodie, the one who had been subjected to discrimination and disrespect, was none other than the President of Burkina Faso. Claire's face drained of color, her hands trembling visibly as she processed the enormity of her earlier actions. The CEO, who moments ago had exuded arrogance, now stumbled backward, his mouth agape in disbelief. "President," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Traore met his gaze briefly, offering a nod that conveyed neither anger nor triumph, just quiet acknowledgement of the truth laid bare. Another officer stepped forward, addressing Claire and the CEO with icy formality. "You two will come with us immediately," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. Panic flickered across Claire's features as she protested weakly, "Wait, what? Why me? I was only doing my job." Her pleas fell on deaf ears as the officers escorted both individuals off the plane, their handcuffs gleaming ominously under the relentless sun. Passengers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama, their expressions ranging from shock to muted satisfaction. Some exchanged knowing glances, while others whispered fervently to their neighbors. The nurse returning to Bobo Dialasso, who had silently observed everything during the flight, shook her head knowingly. "That's our president," she murmured to her seatmate. They didn't even know who they were humiliating. On the tarmac, the scene unfolded with cinematic clarity. Traore disembarked with quiet dignity, greeted by a sea of saluting soldiers and cheering crowds gathered beyond the airport fence. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every step of his triumphant return. Yet, unlike the pomp and circumstance typical of such occasions, there was a palpable sense of gravitas in the air. This wasn't merely a celebration of one man's arrival, it was a reaffirmation of national pride, a declaration to the world that Burkina Faso demanded respect on its own terms. The ministers accompanying Traore wore expressions of quiet determination, their presence underscoring the gravity of the situation. Here stood a leader who had traveled incognito, endured humiliation, and emerged victorious not through vengeance or retaliation, but through steadfast principle and moral clarity. Meanwhile, Claire and the CEO were led away in handcuffs, their earlier bravado replaced by stark vulnerability. Gone were the smug smiles, the entitled postures. In their place lingered confusion, shame, and fear. They were ushered into separate black vehicles surrounded by elite presidential guards, their fate sealed by the very arrogance that had blinded them to basic human decency. Back inside the terminal, Traore addressed a small press gathering, his words measured yet piercing. "In Burkina Faso," he began, his voice calm but authoritative, "we do not measure a man's worth by the color of his skin or the size of his wallet. We reject colonial habits and outdated hierarchies. Here, dignity, humanity, and respect are non-negotiable values. This is the new Africa." The statement sent ripples across the globe, igniting conversations about equality, representation, and the enduring legacy of colonialism. Social media erupted with hashtags like #RespectAfrica and #StandWithBurkina, as Africans and allies worldwide celebrated a moment that transcended borders and cultures. Young people across the continent cheered, inspired by the image of a humble leader standing tall against injustice. Even international media outlets scrambled to cover the story, highlighting how a single act of discrimination had sparked a global reckoning. For Claire and the CEO, the consequences were swift and severe. Formal charges of public insult, discrimination, and abuse of power were filed against them, marking a rare instance where privilege failed to shield wrongdoing. The French embassy attempted diplomatic intervention, flooding Burkina Faso with phone calls and requests for leniency. But Traore remained resolute. "This is not a colony," he responded firmly. "This is a sovereign nation. Justice will prevail equally for all." Air France issued a hurried apology, replete with corporate jargon and empty platitudes, but it did little to quell the outrage. Calls for a boycott spread rapidly, with citizens of Burkina Faso and neighboring countries vowing to hold the airline accountable. During questioning, Claire broke down in tears, pleading ignorance. "I didn't know who he was," she sobbed, clutching her hands together. "I was just following procedures." The investigator regarded her coldly. "You didn't need to know who he was," he replied sternly. "You only needed to treat him like a human being." The CEO, facing potential legal repercussions in multiple jurisdictions, tried leveraging his influence to escape punishment. But the court delivered a powerful verdict: no immunity, no special treatment. Justice would be blind, impartial, and absolute. Through it all, Traore maintained his characteristic composure. He never gloated, never mocked those who had wronged him. Instead, he returned to the presidential palace and resumed his duties, building roads, empowering youth, strengthening the military, and defending the land. Yet, the incident aboard the plane became legend, a testament to the transformative power of humility, integrity, and resilience. It reminded the world that true leadership isn't defined by titles or accolades but by the ability to inspire change, uphold justice, and champion humanity. And so, as the sun set over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the cityscape, the events of that day served as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage can ignite revolutions, reshape narratives, and restore dignity to nations. #Echoes of Change, Lessons in Leadership and Humanity. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and the events aboard Air France Flight AF 726 extend far beyond the confines of a single airplane or a fleeting moment of confrontation. It serves as a microcosm of broader societal challenges, issues of prejudice, privilege, and the enduring struggle for equality in a world still grappling with the legacies of colonialism and systemic discrimination. At its core, this narrative underscores timeless lessons about leadership, humility, and the transformative power of standing up for what is right, even when faced with adversity. One of the most profound takeaways from this episode is the importance of leading by example. Traoré's choice to travel incognito, eschewing the trappings of power for the sake of connection and authenticity, exemplifies a leadership style rooted in service rather than self-aggrandizement. In a world where leaders often prioritize visibility and recognition, his decision to blend in with ordinary citizens speaks volumes about his commitment to understanding the lived experiences of those he represents. By choosing to walk among the people, he demonstrated that true authority does not stem from titles or displays of wealth but from the trust and respect earned through genuine engagement. Leaders across industries, from politics to business to education, can draw inspiration from this approach, recognizing that proximity to their communities fosters empathy, accountability, and meaningful progress. Equally significant is the lesson in confronting injustice with grace and resolve. When faced with discriminatory treatment, Traoré could have reacted impulsively, allowing anger to dictate his response. Instead, he chose a path of measured resistance, using his calm demeanor and sharp intellect to expose the flaws in Claire's actions without resorting to hostility. This teaches us that addressing prejudice requires not only courage but also strategic thinking and emotional intelligence. Whether in workplace settings, social interactions, or institutional policies, individuals must be empowered to call out discriminatory behavior while maintaining composure and clarity. Doing so not only dismantles harmful practices but also sets a precedent for how such issues should be handled, with fairness, transparency, and unwavering commitment to justice. Moreover, the incident highlights the critical role of accountability in fostering equitable environments. The swift legal action taken against Claire and the CEO sent a clear message: no one is above the law, regardless of status or influence. This principle is essential for dismantling systems of oppression and ensuring that marginalized voices are heard and respected. Organizations and governments alike must establish robust mechanisms for addressing grievances and holding perpetrators accountable, creating spaces where everyone feels valued and protected. For instance, companies can implement bias training programs, anonymous reporting channels, and inclusive hiring practices to mitigate discrimination.
Similarly, nations can strengthen anti-discrimination laws and promote civic education to cultivate societies that celebrate diversity and reject exclusionary norms. Another key insight from this story is the power of collective action in driving change. While Traoré's intervention was pivotal, it was the subsequent outcry from citizens, activists, and global allies that amplified the impact of his stand. Social media played a crucial role in spreading awareness, galvanizing support, and pressuring institutions to take corrective measures. This underscores the importance of solidarity in combating injustice. Individuals may feel powerless alone, but united efforts can challenge entrenched systems and effect lasting transformation. Movements advocating for racial equity, gender parity, and economic justice rely on this principle, demonstrating that collective advocacy can shift cultural paradigms and policy frameworks. Finally, the narrative reinforces the idea that dignity is universal and non-negotiable. Traoré's insistence on being treated with respect regardless of external markers of identity reflects a fundamental truth: every individual deserves to be seen as inherently worthy. This perspective challenges deeply ingrained biases and encourages a shift toward more inclusive mindsets. For example, educators can emphasize the value of diverse perspectives in classrooms, employers can foster work cultures that celebrate differences, and policymakers can design initiatives that address disparities in access and opportunity. By embedding dignity into the fabric of our interactions and institutions, we pave the way for a more compassionate and equitable society. In conclusion, the events surrounding Traoré's flight offer invaluable lessons that resonate across contexts and communities. They remind us that leadership is not about wielding power over others but about empowering them, that confronting injustice demands both courage and strategy, that accountability is the cornerstone of fairness, that collective action magnifies individual voices, and that dignity must always remain at the heart of our endeavors. These principles are not abstract ideals, they are actionable imperatives that guide us toward a future defined by mutual respect, shared prosperity, and enduring peace. As we reflect on this story, let it inspire us to embody these values in our daily lives, contributing to a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive with honor and integrity.